Hi Andrew, this is the feedback for your mock exam for paper 2 reading questions. As you can see, if you look at the mark scheme for question 1, you scored all 4 marks, so that's a good starter. If we move on to question 2, which asks you to write a summary of the differences between Eddie and Henry, you've given some very good explanations of the differences between the two boys. You've picked up on the fact that Eddie is a typical modern day teenager, whereas Henry's in a boarding school in the 1800s. You've also mentioned that Eddie is well fed and has all the home comforts and his friends around him, whereas Henry is isolated, nothing to do, no friends, and he's not treated very well at school, and the food isn't very good. If we look at the mark scheme now, you can see for band 2 it says attempts some inferences from one or both texts, and for level 3 makes clear inferences from both texts. I feel that you have certainly made some attempts from both texts. However, to gain the higher marks for band 3, I think you would have need to make more detailed perceptive inferences. For example, mentioning the fact that Eddie seems to make fun of his father and appears to have a good relationship with him, whereas the relationship between Henry and his father, it does seem to be very cold and distant. I also get the impression that from the letter that Henry has written to his father that he's trying to persuade him to let him come home, but I also get the impression from the other letter that Henry's dad is somewhat suspicious of him and would prefer to speak to George to get the true facts of the matter. Going back to the mark scheme, if we look at level 2, for the next bullet point, it says select some appropriate references and textual detail from both texts. Unfortunately, this is one area that you don't seem to have given much thought to. You do include a couple of paraphrased examples. You say that the bread is black, and at the end here you say that Henry's starving and would rather work all his life than stay at that school. However, because of this, it limits your score to the bottom of level 2. So unfortunately, you've only scored 3 out of the 8 marks for this one. Had you included quotes from each text to back up each of your points, you would have scored the top end of level 2, so it would have given you 4 out of 8. And had you included some of the more detailed perceptions that I mentioned earlier, you would have been scoring certainly band 3, if not band 4. So well done. Moving on to question 3, where you're asked, how does Henry use language to try to influence his father? I think you seem to have missed out on the main point of the fact that he's trying to persuade him to let him come home using emotive language. You've said here that he sounds as if he's reaching out for help from his father, which is a good point. However, you need to say the fact that he's using emotive language or direct address to appeal directly to his father. You could also have referenced the fact that he repeats "my dear father" several times throughout the letter, trying to influence his father and let him know how dear he is to him, although the fact that he's been at boarding school for 2 years kind of gives you the opposite opinion of that. As this question is worth 12 marks, you would need to write about at least 4 different points of the language used to try to influence his father. You would also need to include quotes for each of your points to back up your argument and use the correct terminology where possible. If we look at the mark scheme for question 3, it says attempts to comment on the effects of the language. You have done that. Select some appropriate textual detail. I think you've used 1 quote and then paraphrased 1, and make some use of subject terminology, mainly appropriately. Unfortunately, that's the bit that you've not really done. So that limits your score to the bottom end of level 2. so it gives you 4 marks out of 12. If you had included some mention of the terminology, it would have given you marks towards the top end, 5 or 6 out of 12. And if you'd included some more points with quotes and the relevant terminology, you could have been scoring into band 3. Overall, that gives you a score of 11 out of 24, which for your first attempt at this exam paper, that's not a bad effort. And now we'll work towards making sure that you're boxing off all the points that I've mentioned, ready for your exam in June. Well done, Andrew.